A female employee was fired during her maternity leave for being no longer a good fit. No warning, no conversation, just a cold email ending everything she had worked for. But what they didn't know, she was the daughter of the company's largest investor. Emma Carter was the kind of employee no one noticed until something went wrong. At 32, she carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the one chasing attention. With her soft brown hair often tied into a low, practical bun and minimal makeup, Emma preferred simplicity over flash. Her sharp hazel eyes, however, missed nothing. She had a calm, steady demeanor, shaped by years of solving problems behind the scenes rather than seeking credit for them. What most people didn't know was that Emma had been like this since her early 20s. After losing her mother at a young age, she had learned to be self-reliant, composed, and resilient. Emotions were something she kept private. Responsibility, however, was something she carried effortlessly. At the company, Emma was officially a senior operations manager. Unofficially, she was the person who fixed everything. When a major client nearly pulled out due to a system failure, Emma worked overnight to resolve it, without escalating it to upper management. When internal departments clashed, she quietly mediated, ensuring deadlines were still met. When executives made unrealistic promises, Emma was the one who somehow made them possible. And yet, in meetings, her name was rarely mentioned. Daniel Brooks, her direct supervisor, was a man in his early 40s, tall, lean, always dressed in perfectly tailored suits. He had a sharp jawline and a permanent expression of authority. To most people, he appeared charismatic and decisive. But behind closed doors, Daniel had a different reputation. He was known for taking credit where it wasn't his and avoiding responsibility when things went wrong. Years ago, Daniel had failed in a major project that nearly cost him his career. Since then, he had developed a habit: position himself in front of success and step away from failure. Emma, unknowingly, had become his safety net. "Great work, team," Daniel would often say in meetings, standing at the head of the table. But when results were praised, it was his name that executives remembered. Emma never corrected him, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. Across from her desk sat Sarah Mitchell, a 29-year-old project coordinator with a warm smile and expressive eyes. Unlike Emma, Sarah was more open, more emotional, and far more vocal about what she believed was right. She admired Emma, not just for her competence, but for her patience. One late afternoon, as the office lights dimmed and most employees had already left, Sarah leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Emma, you need to be careful." Emma looked up from her screen, slightly puzzled. "About what?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before continuing. "They're talking, management. They think you've become replaceable." For the first time that day, Emma paused, not because she was surprised, but because she had seen it coming. Still, she gave a small, reassuring smile. "It's fine, I'll handle it." Sarah frowned. "That's what you always say." Emma didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her screen, finishing the final adjustments on a report that would be presented the next morning, by Daniel. At that moment, Emma made a decision. She would stay quiet. Not because she was weak, but because she had something more important to protect now: her child, her peace, and the fragile balance of her life just before everything was about to change. Emma Carter's last day before maternity leave was quiet. Too quiet for someone who had carried half the company on her shoulders. There was no farewell meeting, no heartfelt send-off, just a few polite nods and a short email from HR wishing her a smooth transition. At 8 months pregnant, Emma moved slower now, her posture slightly tense from the weight she carried, yet her expression remained composed as always. She left behind detailed documents, contingency plans, and step-by-step systems, everything the company would need to function without her. Or so she thought. The first week at home felt unfamiliar. Between sleepless nights and the soft cries of her newborn daughter, Emma tried to disconnect from work. But habits don't disappear easily. She checked her inbox out of instinct one morning and noticed something strange. Fewer emails. Threads she had once been included in were suddenly silent. At first, she dismissed it. Until the second week. Important updates were missing. Weekly reports she used to oversee were no longer shared with her. Calendar invites, gone. Meetings she used to lead were happening without her. Then came the first real sign. She tried logging into the company's internal system. Access denied. Emma stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than usual, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. It wasn't an error. It was intentional. Back at the office, Jake Reynolds had just taken her seat. Jake was 27, tall and slightly awkward in posture, with neatly combed blonde hair and an eagerness that bordered on nervous energy. Fresh from a fast-track MBA program, he had built a reputation for being ambitious, quick-talking, and overly confident in rooms where he had little real experience. To management, he represented fresh perspective. To those who actually worked with him, he was clearly unprepared. Still, Jake didn't question why he was there. "This used to be Emma's role, right?" he asked casually during a meeting. Daniel Brooks adjusted his cufflinks, his tone smooth and dismissive. "Yes, but we're moving in a different direction now." Jake nodded, accepting the answer without digging deeper. Not everyone was as comfortable. Sarah Mitchell noticed the shift immediately. She saw Jake struggling with reports Emma used to finalize in minutes. She saw confusion in meetings where Emma's absence created silent gaps no one could fill. And more importantly, she saw something else. Emma was being erased. One evening, long after most employees had left, Sarah sat alone at her desk, hesitating before opening her laptop again. She knew she shouldn't, but she did. Carefully, she forwarded a set of internal reports to a private email address, Emma's email. Back at home, Emma checked her phone as her baby finally fell asleep in her arms. A new message appeared. From Sarah. Attached files, internal discussions, updated project statuses. Emma opened them slowly, her eyes scanning each line. They had already replaced her in meetings. They had reassigned her responsibilities. And now, they were cutting her out completely. She didn't react immediately. No anger, no panic. Just a quiet, growing understanding. This wasn't temporary. This was deliberate. Emma leaned back, holding her daughter a little closer, her gaze steady and unreadable. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about how to fix things. She was starting to see the truth. They weren't waiting for her to come back. They were preparing to move on without her. The email arrived at 6:42 a.m. Emma Carter was sitting by the window, her newborn daughter resting quietly against her chest, wrapped in a soft cream blanket. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a calm, almost peaceful glow across the room. It was the kind of moment that should have felt safe. Then her phone vibrated. She glanced down, expecting another forwarded document from Sarah, or perhaps a routine company update she was no longer part of. Instead, she saw the sender, HR department. For a brief second, Emma didn't move. Her expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened slightly around the phone. She opened the email. No greeting, no acknowledgement of her years of service, just a short paragraph. After careful consideration, we regret to inform you that your role is no longer aligned with the company's direction. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. You are no longer a fit. Emma read it once, then again. Her daughter stirred gently in her arms, unaware of the silence that had suddenly filled the room. There was no call, no meeting, no warning, just words. Cold, final, detached. Emma didn't cry, not immediately. Instead, she stared at the screen, her mind moving faster than her emotions. Years of dedication, late nights, solved crises, invisible sacrifices, all reduced to a few lines sent at dawn, as if timing it early enough would make it easier to ignore. It didn't. Across town, Sarah Mitchell was already awake, pacing in her small apartment. She had seen the internal notice minutes before it was sent externally. Her face was tense, her usual warmth replaced with frustration. They actually did it, she muttered to herself. Sarah grabbed her phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing Emma's number. But she stopped before pressing call. What could she even say? That she was sorry? That she saw it coming? Neither felt like enough. Back at the Carter residence, another presence entered the room. Richard Carter, Emma's father, stood by the doorway. In his early 60s, Richard was a tall man with silver-streaked hair, a composed posture, and an aura of quiet authority. His face carried the calm of someone who had spent decades making high-stakes decisions. Unlike Emma, who kept her strength hidden, Richard's presence made his power unmistakable. He had built his life in the world of investments, sharp, strategic, and rarely surprised. But this time, something in Emma's silence caught his attention. "Emma?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned the phone slightly, showing him the screen. Richard stepped closer, his eyes scanning the email. For a moment, nothing changed in his expression. Then, almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightened. "They fired you. Like this?" he said quietly. Emma nodded once, still calm, still composed, but her eyes had changed. There was no longer uncertainty in them, only clarity. Her mother, Helen Carter, soon appeared behind Richard. Helen was a gentlewoman in her late 50s, with soft features and a caring presence that balanced her husband's intensity. She had always valued people over business, relationships over strategy. When she learned what had happened, her reaction was immediate. "How could they do this to you, after everything?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. Emma finally spoke, her tone soft but firm. "It's not about what I did for them." She looked back at the email one last time before locking her phone. "It's about what they think I'm worth." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something changes. The first cracks didn't look like a collapse. They looked like small delays, minor errors, things most people in the company brushed off as temporary adjustments after Emma's departure. But those who paid attention could feel it immediately. Something was wrong. Jake Reynolds sat at Emma's old desk, his posture slightly hunched as he stared at 3 different screens at once. The confidence he had carried in his first week was fading. His neatly styled blonde hair now looked slightly disheveled, his tie loosened just enough to show discomfort. At 27, Jake had always believed he could learn fast enough to handle anything. But this wasn't a textbook problem. This was chaos. "I don't understand. Why is this system linked to 3 departments?" Jake muttered, scrolling through layers of internal dashboards. No one answered. Because no one knew. Emma had known. Across the room, Daniel Brooks maintained his usual composed appearance. His suit was flawless, his posture confident, but there was a subtle shift in his tone during meetings. He spoke more, explained less, and deflected questions with increasing precision. The kind of man who once thrived on control was now quietly avoiding details. "We're experiencing minor transition issues," Daniel stated during a leadership meeting, his voice steady. But the reality was far from minor. Deadlines began slipping. At first, it was a single report submitted late, then 2. Then entire project timelines started collapsing like dominoes. Departments that once worked in silent coordination now found themselves waiting on each other, confused and misaligned. Sarah Mitchell saw it all. From her desk, she watched emails pile up unanswered, watched Jake struggle through meetings he clearly wasn't ready to lead, and watched managers whisper behind closed doors. But what unsettled her most wasn't the mistakes, it was the absence. Emma had never allowed things to reach this point. One afternoon, the tension finally surfaced. The conference room doors closed as Daniel prepared to meet with one of the company's most important clients, Mr. Jonathan Collins. Mr. Collins was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with a commanding presence. His deep voice carried authority, shaped by decades of running his own successful logistics firm. Known for his directness and intolerance for inefficiency, he valued reliability above all else. And for years, Emma had been the reason he stayed loyal to this company. Until now. "This is the 3rd delay in 2 weeks, Mr. Collins said, his voice low but firm, his eyes locked on Daniel. Daniel offered a practiced smile. "We're currently restructuring internally. These are temporary setbacks." Mr. Collins didn't smile back. "I don't care about your internal issues," he replied. "I care about results, and right now I'm not seeing any." Silence filled the room. Jake sat off to the side, avoiding eye contact, his earlier confidence completely gone. He flipped through documents, but none of them had the answers he needed. Because those answers were never written down. They were in Emma's head. Back outside, Sarah stood near the glass wall, watching the meeting unfold. She didn't need to hear the conversation to understand what was happening. The company wasn't just struggling, it was unraveling. And for the first time, people were starting to notice something they had ignored for years. Emma hadn't just been part of the system, she had been the system. The silence in the Carter household that morning carried a different weight than before. It was no longer just about Emma being fired, it was about understanding what came next. Emma sat at the dining table, her posture straight despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Her daughter rested in a cradle nearby, the soft rhythm of her breathing the only calm in the room. Across from her, Richard Carter placed a tablet down gently, his expression unreadable but focused. For years, Richard had been watching the company from a distance, not as a father, but as an investor. "I didn't step in before," Richard said, his voice measured, "because I wanted to see how they operated without interference." At 62, Richard Carter had built a reputation as a strategic investor who never acted impulsively. Tall, composed, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, he was known in financial circles for one defining trait: patience. But patience, when crossed with principle, could quickly become something else. Emma looked at him, calm but attentive. "And now?" Richard leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Now I have a clearer picture." He tapped the screen, bringing up performance data, declining numbers, delayed projects, client dissatisfaction. Everything aligned with what Emma had already begun to suspect. "They've been relying on you far more than they realize," he continued, "and now they're paying for that ignorance." Helen Carter stood nearby, her arms gently crossed, concern evident on her face. Unlike Richard, Helen's strength came from empathy. She had always supported Emma's decision to build her career independently, never revealing her family background to colleagues. But now, that decision was being tested. "They fired her without even understanding her value," Helen said softly. "That's not just poor management, that's a failure of judgment." Emma remained quiet for a moment, absorbing everything. Her expression didn't show anger, only clarity, the kind that comes when all pieces finally fall into place. "I never told them who I was," Emma said calmly. "I wanted to be judged by my work." Richard nodded once. "And they did judge you." A brief pause followed. "Incorrectly." At that moment, another figure entered the conversation via video call: Michael Grant, Richard's longtime financial advisor. Michael was in his mid-50s, slightly overweight with thinning hair and rectangular glasses that gave him a meticulous, analytical appearance. He had worked with Richard for over 2 decades and was known for his cautious approach to risk. "I've reviewed the company's current position," Michael said, adjusting his glasses. "They're unstable, but not beyond recovery." Emma's eyes shifted slightly. "If someone steps in?" Michael gave a small nod. "Exactly." The room grew quieter. This was no longer about what had happened. It was about what could happen next. Richard turned his attention back to Emma. "The question is not whether the company can be saved," he said. "The question is, should it be?" Helen looked between them, her voice softer now. "After what they did? Do they deserve it?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She glanced at her daughter, then back at the screen displaying the company's failing metrics. For years, she had given everything to that place, not for recognition, but because she believed in the work. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to decide its future, not as an employee, but as someone with the power to change everything. "I'm not thinking about them," Emma finally said. Her voice was calm but firm. "I'm thinking about what happens if no one fixes it." Richard studied her for a moment longer, then gave a slight, approving nod. The decision wasn't made yet, but the truth was clear now. Emma had never just been an employee. She had always been something much more. The numbers no longer lied. What had once been dismissed as temporary setbacks had now escalated into something far more serious. Revenue reports showed a steady decline, operational costs were rising, and worst of all, key clients were beginning to withdraw. Inside the executive floor, the atmosphere had shifted from controlled confidence to quiet desperation. Daniel Brooks stood at the head of the conference table, but this time, there was no composure in his posture. His shoulders were slightly tense, his usual polished tone replaced with urgency. At 43, Daniel had built his career on perception, on appearing in control even when he wasn't. But now, even that illusion was slipping. "We need immediate liquidity," Daniel said, pacing slowly. "If we don't stabilize cash flow within the next quarter, we won't recover." Across from him sat Olivia Grant, the company's chief financial officer. Olivia was in her late 30s, sharp-featured with short dark hair styled in a precise bob. Known for her analytical mind and blunt honesty, she had little patience for corporate politics. Unlike Daniel, she relied on facts, not appearances, and the facts were not in their favor. "We're past stabilization," Olivia replied calmly. "We're in survival mode." The room fell silent. Jake Reynolds sat quietly at the far end of the table, no longer attempting to contribute. His earlier ambition had been replaced by hesitation. He avoided eye contact, his hands clasped together as if trying to make himself invisible. The weight of responsibility he once welcomed now felt overwhelming. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then we find investors." And just like that, the strategy shifted. Within days, the company began reaching out, quietly at first, then more aggressively. Emails were sent, calls were made, meetings were arranged behind closed doors. The message was clear. They were looking for capital. They were looking to sell. Outside the executive floor, whispers spread quickly. Sarah Mitchell noticed it before anyone said it out loud. Documents marked confidential started appearing more frequently. Finance teams worked longer hours. Executives who rarely spoke to each other were suddenly holding private discussions. Something was happening, and it wasn't small. One evening, as Sarah reviewed internal logs, she noticed a pattern: multiple external inquiries, all routed through a single intermediary firm. She leaned closer to her screen, narrowing her eyes. "Who's stepping in?" she murmured. Across the city, in a quiet office overlooking the skyline, that question already had an answer. Richard Carter sat at the head of a long glass table, his posture relaxed but commanding. Beside him was Michael Grant, reviewing documents with careful precision. The room was dimly lit, reflecting the seriousness of the discussion. "They're officially seeking external investment," Michael confirmed. "Their valuation has dropped significantly." Richard gave a faint nod. As expected. At the far end of the table sat Emma. Unlike before, there was something different in her presence. Still calm, still composed, but now there was intention behind her silence. She listened carefully, her eyes scanning the reports in front of her. "They don't know who they're negotiating with," Michael added. A subtle pause followed. Emma closed the folder in front of her. "That's the point," she said quietly. Back at the company, Daniel prepared for what he believed would be a turning point, a meeting with a potential investor group that could save everything. He adjusted his tie, standing straighter, regaining some of his usual confidence. This was his chance to fix things. What he didn't know was that the people sitting on the other side of that negotiation table already knew exactly how this would end. And for the first time since the crisis began, the balance of power had shifted. Silently. Completely. The meeting room was quieter than usual that morning. Not calm. Tense. Daniel Brooks stood near the head of the table, adjusting his suit jacket for the third time in less than a minute. The deal had moved faster than expected. The investor group had agreed to acquire a controlling stake, and today was the first official meeting. This was supposed to be the moment everything stabilized. At least, that's what Daniel believed. Around the table, the executive team sat in uneasy silence. Olivia Grant flipped through printed reports, her sharp eyes scanning every detail, though even she seemed slightly unsettled by how quickly the deal had been finalized. Jake Reynolds sat further down, shoulders stiff, his usual confidence completely gone. He had spent the last few weeks trying and failing to keep up with a role that was never truly his. Then the door opened. All eyes turned. First, Michael Grant entered, his presence calm and professional as always. Behind him, Richard Carter followed, his posture straight, his expression composed yet authoritative. The room shifted immediately. Some recognized him. Most didn't fully understand why he was there. Daniel frowned slightly. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't aware you would be attending personally." Richard gave a faint nod but didn't respond, because someone else walked in behind him, Emma Carter. For a brief second, no one reacted, because no one expected it. Emma stepped into the room with quiet confidence, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was something different now. She was no longer the woman who sat silently in the corner of meetings. Her presence carried weight, authority, finality. Sarah Mitchell, seated near the middle of the table, froze for just a moment, then slowly leaned back in her chair, a small, knowing smile forming on her lips. She understood. Daniel's confusion turned into disbelief. "Emma?" he said, his voice uncertain for the first time. Jake looked up sharply, his eyes widening as realization hit him all at once. The seat he had taken, the responsibilities he couldn't handle, it all made sense now. He wasn't a successor, he was a placeholder. Emma walked to the front of the room, stopping beside Richard. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Every step was controlled. Michael placed a document on the table. "The acquisition has been completed," he announced. "Effective immediately, the company is under new ownership." Silence. Heavy. Absolute. Daniel's face tightened. "And who exactly?" Emma spoke before he could finish. "We are." Her voice was calm, steady, leaving no room for doubt. Daniel stared at her, the pieces finally coming together, but far too late. Olivia lowered her papers slowly, her sharp mind already processing the implications. She didn't speak, but her expression shifted from confusion to understanding. Sarah exhaled softly, her smile still there. This was it. Emma looked around the room, meeting each gaze without hesitation. The same people who once overlooked her, dismissed her, erased her, now sitting across from her, waiting. She let the silence stretch just long enough. Then she spoke. "They thought I was replaceable." Her eyes settled on Daniel. "Now I own your decisions." No one moved. No one spoke. Because in that moment, everything had changed. Completely. The silence after Emma's words didn't last long. It couldn't. Because what followed wasn't just a shift in power, it was the beginning of consequences. Emma remained standing at the front of the room, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush her words. Authority didn't need volume. "It ends today," she said calmly. Daniel Brooks stiffened, trying to recover what little control he had left. His sharp features tightened, and for the first time, the confidence that once defined him was gone. "You can't just walk in and I already did," Emma interrupted, her tone still even. "And I've reviewed everything." Michael Grant stepped forward, placing a series of documents in front of each executive. "Internal audits, decision logs, financial breakdowns," he said. "Everything tied to leadership accountability." Olivia Grant picked up the file first, her eyes moving quickly across the pages. Unlike the others, she didn't look shocked. She looked resigned. She had seen the warning signs long before this moment. Emma continued, "This company didn't fail overnight. It failed because of repeated decisions made without responsibility." Her eyes moved across the room, stopping briefly at each face. Starting with leadership. The words were clear, final. Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "So what? You're firing everyone?" Emma didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. "Effective immediately," Michael announced. "Daniel Brooks is relieved of his position." The room froze again, but this time no one questioned it. Daniel's expression shifted from disbelief to anger, but beneath it, something else surfaced. Fear. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he had no position to stand on. Security was already waiting outside. As Daniel was escorted out, The illusion of his authority disappeared with him. Emma didn't watch him leave. She had already moved on. Next, she said. Two other senior managers were quietly dismissed. Individuals who had supported poor decisions, ignored warnings, and prioritized convenience over accountability. Their exits were less dramatic, but no less significant. Then Emma turned her attention to someone else. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. She straightened slightly, unsure of what was coming next. You stayed, Emma said, even when you knew things were wrong. Sarah hesitated. I didn't know what else to do. Emma gave a small nod. You paid attention. That matters. A brief pause. I'd like you to step into a leadership role. Operations oversight. The room shifted again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was recognition. Sarah exhaled slowly, processing the weight of the moment. I won't let you down. I know, Emma replied. Across the table, Jake Reynolds sat quietly, his hands clasped, his expression uncertain. He expected to be next. Emma looked at him, not with judgment, but with clarity. You were placed in a position you weren't ready for, she said. That's not entirely your fault. Jake nodded slightly, relief mixing with embarrassment. You'll be reassigned, Emma added. Proper training, real responsibility. It wasn't punishment, it was correction. Finally, Emma turned to the larger picture. Reach out to former clients, she instructed. Personally, start with Mr. Collins. Olivia nodded. He'll need reassurance. He'll get results, Emma said, because this time things would be different. Not louder, not faster, better. As the meeting came to an end, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The fear was still there, but now it was balanced with something else. Structure, direction, hope. Emma stood alone for a moment after everyone began to leave, her eyes scanning the room that once overlooked her. Now, it answered to her. Not because of who she was born to be, but because of everything she had proven long before anyone noticed. So, Emma didn't just come back, she took control. But what about you? Would you save the company that betrayed you, or let it fall? Admit your mistakes, or protect your pride like Daniel? Stay silent, or speak up like Sarah? Tell me in the comments, what would you choose? Like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.